Local fire departments play an essential role for the safety of civilians in the province of New Brunswick. During an emergency, whether it be a fire, car accident, or medical emergency, firefighters are the first to be called and the first on scene. In New Brunswick, there are three categories of firefighters, which include full-time firefighters, paid when called firefighters, and volunteer firefighters. The province of New Brunswick has two fire departments that are fully paid and do not have volunteers. There are 14 departments that have both full-time and volunteer firefighters, and 158 fully volunteer departments. The fully volunteer departments are primarily in rural areas where there is not a large enough population to sustain a full fire department. With this, volunteer firefighters are essential for rural areas as they are the sole means of fire safety and rescue teams. This is why training volunteer firefighters is so important.
Anyone can become a volunteer firefighter, even you. There are different levels of volunteer firefighters. The different levels are entry-level volunteer firefighters, Level 1 volunteer firefighters, and Level 2 volunteer firefighters. If you started volunteering at the fire department today, you would be considered an entry-level volunteer. The main difference between the levels is the training they have and the zones they are restricted to. Fire departments have control zones to help maintain the safety of a volunteer. These zones are labeled cold, warm, and hot. Entry-level volunteers are restricted to the cold zone only. Because they don't have as much training, they aren't able to go to dangerous areas that require breathing apparatuses. Entry-level volunteers are only able to assist other firefighters with equipment, drive the trucks, and put away equipment, among other things. Level 1 and Level 2 volunteer firefighters can enter the hot zone because they have more training and a better understanding of emergency situations. Even though training is given to volunteer firefighters on an ongoing basis, they are only required to participate in 60% of the courses offered by their fire department every year. Entry-level volunteers only need to take part in these training sessions, while Level 1 and Level 2 volunteer firefighters also have to take courses through New Brunswick Community College and receive certification. This becomes a training issue when volunteer firefighters are faced with a situation where they don't have the proper knowledge to react to the event. Because firefighters are faced with emergency situations, they may be putting their safety and the safety of the public in danger. This is why volunteer firefighters should undergo extensive training to help them have a basic foundation of knowledge when they are faced with life or death situations.
When you begin working with a volunteer fire department, you start as an entry-level volunteer firefighter. These types of volunteers have small but important roles. They respond to emergency calls and arrive at the scene, but are not able to get too close to the accident because they don't have proper training. The entry-level volunteer firefighters have to make sure that they stay out of harm's way and must stay in the cool zone. They don't require any formal training to volunteer and don't require certification in CPR or first aid. However, every volunteer firefighter has to take part in 60% of the training programs put on by their fire department each year. No course is mandatory, and they can choose which courses they participate in. These training programs are put on by instructors who are subject matter experts and are presented as a lecture. These training sessions are often referred to as Death by PowerPoint.
To become a Level 1 or Level 2 volunteer firefighter, they must also take a course from the New Brunswick Community College or another school that provides a similar program. The course that they must take to achieve Level 1 or Level 2 volunteer firefighter is split into 5 blocks. Each block highlights important aspects of firefighting. There is a theory component and hands-on component associated with each block. Firefighters have to complete 83 hours of theory, 20 hours of practical in classroom, and 55 hours of practical in the fire station. They also have to complete 16 hours of CPR and first aid training. Once they have completed all 5 blocks of Level 1, it does not have to be renewed. The New Brunswick Community College currently has records of its certifications dating back to 1988 because they never expire. After the completion of this course, the volunteer firefighters are assumed to have good knowledge of firefighting. Volunteer firefighters are also given hands-on training for putting out fires. Smokehouses are used where the volunteer firefighters simulate going into a burning building, rescuing people, and putting out the fire. This is the only hands-on training that is put on by the fire departments for their crew. Simulations allow firefighters a chance to experience similar situations to what they may face when on the job.
The knowledge of volunteer firefighters is not tested very often. Entry-level volunteer firefighters have to participate in 60% of training classes put on by their fire department, but their knowledge and retention of the information is not tested. They are not required to take a test after the completion of a training program, and they don't need to show retention or application of their new knowledge. Level 1 volunteer firefighters and Level 2 volunteer firefighters have to take firefighting courses from a college such as NBCC. They are tested after they complete each block. At the end of each block, they have to pass a final exam to be considered a Level 1 or Level 2 firefighter. In order to pass, they have to receive a mark of 60% or higher. Once they have received their Level 1 or Level 2, they do not have to take any additional courses. That means that once they initially pass the firefighting blocks, they are not tested again. It is unknown how much of the information and training they retain from Level 1 and Level 2 courses because they are not retested.
With this, much of the learning can be forgotten over the course of time. It is also difficult to prepare volunteer firefighters for all situations that may occur, as they are required to respond to many different types of emergencies. Volunteer firefighters of all levels are only required to attend a portion of the training sessions. Those who have received formal training from the New Brunswick Community College are not required to renew or update their certification. Any training that they have done in the past may be lost over time if it is not used. When knowledge is not used for a certain amount of time, retention usually goes down. This means that without active practice, the training may not be useful because information will not be maintained. This leads volunteer firefighters to rely on instinct and make connections with past experiences, so they are often required to use their sense-making abilities. Often, the contextual cues will override formal training and lead sense-making to fail. As volunteer firefighters are first responders, they do not have much room for error, and if their sense-making fails, there can be major consequences.
Volunteer firefighters should be given more hands-on training to put their skills to use. When information is given in lecture format, it is hard to remember everything, especially when you cannot see how skills are being used. Having more hands-on training would help with error management because the volunteer firefighters could try out their new knowledge, see how it works, and make mistakes to help them learn. Having the opportunity to make mistakes in a training session would be helpful because the volunteer firefighters would be able to make errors and learn from them. There is not much room for error when they respond to an emergency call, so having the opportunity to practice would be very beneficial. Introducing coaching or mentoring for the volunteer firefighters would also be helpful. After an emergency call, the volunteer can review the steps they took during the emergency and evaluate what they did well and what they can improve on. Talking about the process they took and the results can also help them in the future.
Training for volunteer firefighters is very important for both the safety of the firefighters and the safety of the public. Volunteer firefighters are often the first to respond to emergency calls, so it's important that they have a good understanding of what to do in emergency situations. Training is an important aspect of knowing how to react, so volunteer firefighters should have ongoing training to make sure that they are prepared for situations before they arise. If they are not properly trained, it could have negative consequences. Therefore, more training should be included for volunteer firefighters. Evaluation is also an important part of training. With volunteer firefighters, there is not much evaluation that takes place to test their knowledge and retention of information. In order to be sure that volunteer firefighters are well prepared to respond to emergency situations, there should be more evaluation. However, the current training for volunteer firefighters seems to be working for the time being because volunteers respond to and diffuse emergency situations as they happen. Without volunteer firefighters, rural areas would not have any means of fire protection, so volunteer firefighters are a very important part of sustaining a community. With this, the training of volunteer firefighters is very important.